Good morning. Here's your early warning morning briefing for Monday, the 27th of January, 2025. I'm your host, Mark Nielsen, and I'm joined by the team, Robert, Jared, and Mike Shelby. A lot has happened over the last several days since we last met, so let's jump right into it. So inside the Beltway, Speaker Mike Johnson on Saturday extended an invitation for President Donald Trump to address a joint session of Congress on March 4th. This will be the first of Trump's speeches or State of the Union addresses for his second presidency. It's also worth noting that more Americans now approve of Trump's presidency than they did when he entered office in 2017. Trump started his first term with a net negative approval rating at -3 points, but now he stands at a net positive of 6 points. That's up 9 points from January 2017. Moving on, Vice President J.D. Vance, in an interview with Face the Nation, said that tech companies would be on notice for their past censorship activities. Vance went on to say that these tech companies can stop engaging in censorship. Otherwise, the Trump administration will not look too kindly on them. It's also worth noting that President Trump signed an executive order banning federal censorship of online speech upon taking office. And then finally, the Trump administration said that it will hold off on implementing a blanket 25% tariff on Colombia after a deal was reached to repatriate illegal immigrants over the weekend. And there was a bit of a standoff between Colombia and the United States over that. Robert, what's going on with that?
Good morning, Mark. So last night, the Trump administration said they're going to hold off on this blanket 25% tariff threat on Colombia after they reached a deal to repatriate illegal immigrants. I think this is basically creating a blueprint for how the Trump administration is going to respond to other Latin American governments that refuse to take these repatriation flights. While the Colombian government and their president, Petro, were publicly resisting, negotiations apparently continued between the Trump administration and Colombian officials behind the scenes. I think that other Latin American countries that publicly resist repatriation are also going to cooperate with the Trump administration while attempting to save face for domestic audiences. And I think one really good book on this specific topic is actually John Mearsheimer's Why Leaders Lie. And in it, he looks at, how states interact with each other on the international stage. And one of the big things is they may lie, regularly for domestic consumption, but they don't lie to each other very often because there could be a lot of blowback here. And I think this is what happened in this case, where the Colombian government and Trump administration were talking to each other. And, they were having, the Colombian government was being truthful with the Trump administration and eventually said they would take these repatriation flights while Petro was trying to save face with domestic political audiences.
All right. Thanks, Robert. Jared, you're our global guy. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I think the idea that this is primarily focused on the Colombian domestic audience is probably correct, but also it points to a probable ineffectiveness of the meeting that we covered in Mexico City. I think it was last week, maybe the week before, where a lot of the Latin American countries, they got together to discuss a unified response. But here we have kind of a disjointed response, and Honduras is calling for an emergency meeting of CELAC for the same thing. That's Community of the Latin American and Caribbean States in Spanish. Now, that shows to me that they didn't really make a good response. And I think Robert touched on it. It opens up the possibility to just kind of allowing the U.S. to piecemeal attack each country and bring them back on side.
Yeah, I think that's the dynamic happening here is that because of this disorganization among, the response from these Latin American states, it's allowing the Trump administration to, basically divide and conquer on the specific issue. And I think as more of these countries individually start to cooperate with the Trump administration, it's going to make it harder for, follow-on countries to resist.
All right. Thanks, guys. All right. Let's now move on to our situation report. We're going to kick things off here. It appears that Trump is going to order a full FEMA review. What's going on with that, Robert?
Yeah, President Donald Trump said he's going to sign an executive order that will overhaul the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and his press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, said that this EO will establish a review council that will advise Trump on steps to reform FEMA. And then moving on to the next sit-rep item, Canadian and Mexican steelmakers said they're refusing U.S. orders, and this is according to people familiar with Canadian steelmaker Stelco, and said they paused all U.S. sales. And Flack Global Metal CEO Jeremy Flack said that Mexico-based steel producers have also stopped taking U.S. orders in anticipation of Trump administration tariffs. And this is important because Canada and Mexico are in the top 5 of U.S. steel, U.S. steel imports. So this could have some major disruptions to industry in the United States while they try to figure out what their next step is if Trump does implement these 25% blanket tariffs on Saturday against Canada and Mexico.
Hey, Robert, I just wanted to step in real quick on this just to kind of flesh out a little bit perspective on this. So as I understand it, because it appears that there are impending tariffs, that a lot of these steel makers are going to be holding back on their supply until that gets resolved. This is not necessarily like a punitive measure to try to restrict steel from the United States alone to kind of get back at the United States. This appears to be more of like an economic decision. Am I getting that right?
Yeah. This is not, as far as I understand, the Canadian and Mexican governments stepping in and trying to cut off exports. This is the companies trying to figure out how, what is actually going to happen with these potential tariffs this weekend and how that is going to impact their supply chains. And yeah, this is just a pause from private industry and not any kind of retaliatory measure on the Trump administration. And then moving on to the next, Tren de Aragua members were arrested in Denver over the weekend, and the Drug Enforcement Administration said that around 50 members of Tren de Aragua were arrested outside of Denver, Colorado, during a raid of a makeshift nightclub. This is apparently just north of Aurora, Colorado, where there were reports, I think we talked about last year, where Tren de Aragua had actually taken over an apartment complex.
All right. Thanks, Robert. Let's move over now to our global portion of our sit rep. Jared, what's going on?
Good morning again. So the Philippines announced that they will officially participate in the exercise Talisman Sabre this year. This will be the first time that the Philippines participates in this exercise. And for those who don't know, that the Talisman Sabre exercise is a major annual exercise run by Australia, comprising tens of thousands of troops at sea, in the air, and conducting amphibious warfare. It's all about fighting for and capturing a coastline. This is part of a much larger regional security integration movement between America and her allies. Obviously, Australia is here. The Japanese participated, I believe, last year. If not, they will definitely be participating this year. It is part of a much larger trend we've been tracking here at the Early Warning Network for the better part of 2 years. Actually, it might have even been over 2 years now. All right. And additionally, the Mexican Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum ordered her government to produce a security proposal to America to reduce violence in Mexico, prevent drugs from crossing into America, prevent arms trafficking. President Sheinbaum also alluded to economic problems for organizations that are caught working with the cartels, which we discussed last week when the banks that are down in Mexico said that this would be know your customer times 10 as far as impact on them. Additionally, the Navy issued new guidance on the discontinuation of the diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. The Navy ordered, you need to be perfectly clear about that all sailors to report any attempts to hide DEI or, quote, similar ideologies done since backdated to the 5th of November, 2024. All of these reports need to go to the Office of Personnel Management by Saturday. And additionally, if sailors are caught hiding it or participating in it or not reporting the hiding of DEI programs, they would actually face adverse consequences. This is per the CNO, the top officer in the Navy. What that means is likely a captain's mast or potentially even an admiral's mast, which is like a non-judicial punishment. For those that weren't in the Navy there. They're taking it very seriously and trying to take this out root and branch. I think it really points to now Secretary of Defense Hegseth's lethality motif that he's been running with since he was nominated.
All right, thanks, Jared. All right, now let's move on to our warning items for the day. Okay, let's start with this, what we're seeing with Chinese telecoms. It looks like China has, for many years, been laying the groundwork to control telecoms around the world. Robert, what's going on with this, and do we have any developments of note?
Yeah, last week, the House Energy Committee held a hearing on U.S. leadership in wireless technology. And there were some interesting comments from lawmakers and also the Open RAN, or Radio Access Network Policy Coalition Director, Diane Ronaldo. And Ronaldo said that China is using or is pushing proprietary technologies through the International Telecommunications Union to create what she called a first mover advantage that is forcing other countries to adopt Chinese technology standards. And this has China has the goal in this of gaining long-term control over global telecommunications infrastructure. One representative that was at the hearing, Richard Hudson, who's a Republican from North Carolina, pointed out that China is stealing U.S. intellectual property to gain an unfair advantage in setting these international technology standards, and also using these cyber intrusions that we've reported on for the last year on U.S. critical infrastructure networks to gain access to sensitive data and also influence how global networks operate. China, I think the main mechanism here that they're pointing out is that China has used overproduction to subsidize their tech industry. And this has allowed China to gain a global market dominance on some of these key communications technologies and expand both into the Western Hemisphere and into parts of Europe with these 5G telecom deployments. And as part of this hearing, some of these lawmakers did propose reauthorizing the Federal Communications Commission's authority to expand U.S. telecom deployments. Apparently, it lapsed during the Biden administration. And I think the Trump administration is likely going to expand efforts that were started actually in 2020 under the first Trump term to kick Chinese suppliers off of U.S. telecom networks and even sanction more of these Chinese tech firms.
Yeah, Robert, to add a little perspective on this, I'm an old Africa hand, so I spent a lot of my time down in West and Central Africa. Those are places where a lot of these telecoms are fairly new. They do have some infrastructure, but it's always coming from foreign countries. China, I saw firsthand, was able to lay a lot of the groundwork for its own telecom through these telecom unions. So in some of these developing countries that have tenuous relationships with other parts of the world, but then they have connections up to like the Middle East or other areas that are a little more strategically important. This is one of the reasons why that type of strategy for China is of note. It is concerning because once China is able to really get this first mover advantage in many developing parts of the world, whether it's in Africa or even in the Gulf states, it allows them to not only have dominance over those areas, they now have a bargaining chip diplomatically, but then also there's the national security implications. Is once China lays the groundwork, that means that it has complete access to whatever location it's implementing those telecoms, which, as you can imagine, are very important. So I think you're really seeing a confluence of economics, business economics, but also with national security and diplomacy.
Yeah, and I think there's two things here that has basically created this situation. One was, this previous foreign policy dynamic that we covered last week that emphasized these international institutions like these telecom unions. And two, previous foreign policy, like State Department policies that pushed a lot more political ideological goals rather than looking at how China was, because this is not brand new. China has been developing these 5G networks, especially in Latin America and the Western Hemisphere, for more than a year now. I think Jared has covered it pretty extensively over the last 12 months, and this has created a situation where China has been able to take advantage of this international institutional emphasis, while the U.S. foreign policy establishment has failed to also take advantage of it by pushing U.S. telecom dominance, and especially in our own hemisphere.
All right, thanks, Robert. All right, Robert, we're also going to be talking a little bit today about the reshoring of our supply chains. Huge priority for the Trump administration, but as I understand it, will have implications for domestic drug production. What's going on there?
So this was from another House Energy Committee hearing where American Chemistry Council CEO Chris John said that the EPA's evaluation process under what's called the Lautenberg Act has been excessively slow and pushed drug makers to buy these drug precursor chemicals from overseas suppliers. So what this has done, what this is, the EPA under this law has basically a 90-day window to conduct reviews for the importation or production of key chemicals in the United States. And 63% of these reviews, according to Buddy Carter, who's a Georgia Republican, have been delayed for more than a year. And then the fees for these reviews have actually increased by 1,380% since this law was implemented. And what these industry groups like the American Chemistry Council are saying is this is creating bottlenecks in U.S. supply chains and uncertainty, regulatory uncertainty for drug makers in the United States. And this is along the lines of what we've talked about, where officials have warned for a long time now that U.S. medicine and precursor chemical supply chains are vulnerable due to heavy reliance on overseas manufacture. Some of the proposed solutions that were in this hearing included easing regulations on chemicals and tying some of these fees to the EPA, the timeliness of the EPA reviews. And this fee schedule is actually up for renewal in 2026. And there was talk that lawmakers could use this to push the EPA to speed up reviews and actually remove some of this regulatory uncertainty that has pushed these drug makers to look overseas for either the chemicals or production, and actually move this production domestic to domestic facilities.
All right. Thank you, Robert. All right, Robert, we've been talking also a lot about some of these ICE raids. They've been all over the news. We've seen footage. Tom Homan was up in, if I'm not mistaken, I think he was in Chicago, or, at least accompanying some of these raids. As I understand it, these ICE raids footprint have been expanding, and we're starting to see certain areas that are becoming more and more in focus and important. What's going on there? What's happening in North Texas?
Well, as you mentioned, there have been some raids over the last week and the weekend in other major cities, especially sanctuary cities like Los Angeles, California, Chicago, Illinois, and even Seattle, Washington. But I think this expansion of ICE raids into North Texas is significant because, there's an expansion of foreign organized crime in Texas that we've covered, starting last year, especially in the West Texas oil fields. And I think that as these ICE raids expand into other parts of Texas, it's creating a higher threat of confrontation with federal authorities. And then there's also something else I saw where there's a lot of far left online organization, putting out alerts of these ICE raids. And I think this is also elevating the threat by circumventing operational security.
Now, Robert, we've talked a lot about this Resistance 2.0, these efforts to possibly, delay or stall some of these ICE raids. Mike's talked extensively about how, this will be a galvanizing issue, these deportations. Apart from just hearing some of the chatter, have we really seen anything at least popping up as real hardened resistance to this? Or does it seem like this is kind of catching everybody still by surprise?
Well, I think on the far left side, what I've seen mostly has been organizing these, campaigns to alert illegal immigrant populations to where ICE raids are being conducted. I also saw, I think it was a protest in New York, or actually, I think there was also one here in Florida. But I haven't seen any kind of, major moves as far as resisting these deportations. And I think part of that is on the official side, the Trump DOJ has reported, I think a week ago, they put out a memo saying that they are going to go after any state or local officials who interfere with these ICE raids or any kind of federal immigration enforcement. So I think for right now, a lot of groups are kind of caught off guard, and the resistance is failing to form because there are Democrats, especially Democratic officials in some of these areas like California, that are divided on how they're going to resist the Trump administration, or even if they should.
Yeah, just one other thing to note to that is it's been really interesting to watch. I know about 3 weeks before Trump was inaugurated, we talked a little bit about how the Mexican consular network here in the United States, it's really the largest of its kind anywhere in the world, have a very large presence of these consulates. These Mexican consulates in the United States play a major role in our society here. They had an announcement that they would be releasing an app offering legal support for any of Mexican foreign nationals that were kind of wrapped up in some of these deportation efforts, which they expected. I don't know whether that's still ongoing. I've been trying to monitor that, but I haven't really seen that there's been much of those kinds of activities popping up in the news and haven't really seen much of a reaction. This will be interesting to watch. Obviously, this is going to be a very long, drawn-out process. But so far, I think your read is right. I don't really think we've seen much of a hardened resistance has at least been effective at stopping these. But obviously, there will still be a lot has yet to be seen, since this will be a big, heavy lift. All right, thanks, Robert. We're going to now move on over to Jared. Jared, can you please take us through your warning items for the day?
Yes. So big news came out over the weekend. Nova Minerals announced its 2024 exploration program found gallium in one of its Alaskan mines. Now, according to the U.S. Geological Survey, this is the first domestic primary gallium since 1987. So it's been almost 40 years since any gallium's been mined inside of the United States. The USGS also says gallium refining primarily resides with America and its allies. Now, China ceased exporting gallium back in 2024 and controlled about 98% of the world's production in 2022. Now, you may be asking, okay, why does this matter? Well, first off, this is yet another opportunity for America to cut into China's dominance on critical minerals. We just covered 2 weeks ago the enormous lithium deposit that was discovered in the Pacific Northwest that actually totally shifts the balance of power as far as lithium production goes. Here, we don't have hard numbers yet on what the expectations are as far as when they're going to mine, when they're going to, how much they expect to produce. But nevertheless, it will start encroaching in on China's territory because as it stands, basically nobody's getting gallium unless you're in good with China. Additionally, Nova announced that they found antimony, which is also under export restrictions from China.
Yeah, and Jared, just Robert sent a note in here that I think's important. Is China apparently blocked gallium to the U.S. just before the 2024 election after putting export controls on in late 2023. And so, Robert, can you give us like a little bit more information on that, and also kind of what you see is like the importance of gallium? This is one of the very first times I've really heard an explanation of what it is and what it does. Could you flesh that out a little bit?
Yeah. So this was China, what they did was they kind of slow walked these blocks for U.S. exports. In 2023, they put on some additional restrictions requiring like licenses they didn't require previously. And then right before the 2024 election, they just completely blocked gallium and germanium exports to the United States. And these are metals used in defense production for things like night vision devices, smart bombs, missile technologies and stuff like that. And there's been some other key exports that they've either kind of tamped down or completely blocked, like Jared mentioned, antimony. Another one was gunpowder cotton. It's a type of cotton used to make smokeless powder. They've also cut down exports on that, especially to Europe. I think they did that early last year as well. So they've been, I think as we're going forward, we'll probably see China start tamping down on some more of these key exports that they have dominance on.
All right, thanks, Robert. All right, back over to you, Jared.
All right. One quick question. One of the audience members asked which mine they found it in. It was the Wombat Prospect at Estelle Mine, which you can actually see Estelle just under the yellow belt there. Moving on, though, to continue talking about China. So Chinese and Pakistani officials are airing grievances over the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor security and development situation. Longtime viewers of Early Warning Network, even back when we were totally under Forward Observer, we've been discussing the Chinese-Pakistan Economic Corridor for quite some time. The Chinese political secretary to Pakistan is accusing the Pakistanis of expecting too much while also failing to adequately address attacks on the Chinese. For about a year now, we've been covering various separatist attacks on Chinese workers that are there. Pakistani officials, including the minister actually overseeing CPEC's development, are refusing to allow the Chinese People's Liberation Army to provide security to the Chinese and for the PLA Navy to dock in Gwadar, which that information has not actually been public, but it's long been suspected over here by Western analysts, myself included, that China would eventually try to use Gwadar as an overseas naval base of sorts. Now, this they're just coming out and saying it that, hey, they're trying to put them there. They did allude to potentially the PLA Air Force trying to get involved as well, but they didn't specify anything there. Now, China cannot afford to lose the China-Pakistan economic corridor. They simply can't. We covered just on Friday that they're facing a potential multinational blockade in the event that they move on Taiwan. This was supposed to be their secondary route for trade and military access around the Malacca Strait. And here they're saying it's not developed as much as we want. We don't have secure access all the way through, let alone to the port. This appears to be falling apart, but I don't think China's ready to give up on the project. It looks like it's going to be stalled well past the timelines they intended. Additionally, this was actually supposed to be the shining achievement for the Belt and Road Initiative. All of this is under the BRI. This was to further entice developing nations into a deep relationship with China, and here we have a second example of China failing to live up to its promises. The first one was in Sri Lanka, where you ended up with Sri Lanka basically becoming a debtor's nation to China. If the CPEC fails, this will be the second major failure. That's a nationwide failure, and I won't go as far as to say it will be the death of the BRI. I don't think it will. It's too ingrained, but I think it will hinder further development along the Belt and Road Initiative.
Thank you, Jared. All right, Jared, I want to keep you on because that does it for our warning items for the day, but we do have a couple questions. One I would like to send over to you. So Ben asks us about Canada and U.S.-Canada relations. Is Trump just trolling Canada with his talk about making Canada our 51st state, or is there actually like a legitimate proposal in there? Jared, do you have a take on this?
So initially, when Trump said all this, it's been a long time meme in some of the darker corners of the internet that eventually it will, but I figured it was all jokes. However, an interview Trump conducted over the weekend, he said that Trudeau told him that Canada would be a failed state without America's security guarantees. If that is true, I think we should take this a lot more seriously, because that's a head of state while he is in office saying, yeah, we actually can't exist without you. That if the security guarantee is coming from another nation, there are issues there. I think the more likely scenario is Trump attempting to help our geographically closest ally.
All right. Thanks, Jared. All right. I'm going to move on to another question I can answer. We had a question to get from the audience as well, asking about Huawei and its purchase in Africa. As you may recall, we talked a little bit about Chinese telecoms all over the world. Related to Huawei and its purchases made in Africa, it seems that the question relates to how some of those purchases exposed the specifications for many of our routers and switches that we use here in the United States. And then the question was, does anybody know if that situation has been rectified? Because to their knowledge, it hasn't. I would like to just agree with that. I have not heard of any resolution, at least officially. Make no mistake, this has become a huge priority internally, I'm sure, within the intelligence community. But so far, I have not seen anything beyond mitigating efforts to try to mitigate some of the risks posed by China having access to some of the specifications for our routers and switches. This is one of those things that is kind of always it's a struggle when you're dealing with telecoms, when you're dealing with infrastructure. This is something that has to go hand in hand with diplomacy, and Africa is really ground zero for this. So often when we discover these things, there's not really a way in which you can kind of just tear everything out. You have to go for these mitigating steps, and that's what we've had to do since that happened down in Africa. But to my knowledge, it really hasn't been completely rectified, and I don't know if it ever will be. It will have to kind of just be implemented into a process. So that's a great question. Finally, there was just one other question that I wanted to get to before we have to jump. There was a question about some of the reaction to Greenland, the statehood talk from the Trump administration regarding Greenland, and how this is part of sovereign territory among the Danish. There has been, as of this morning, it appears that the Danes are very concerned because they're taking this very seriously. It was early on reported that Trump and some of the officials that have been talking about acquiring Greenland or annexing it or purchasing it or whatever, it was just bluster and not serious. But as of this morning, it appears that Danish officials are taking it very seriously, and that some of the back channel talks over this have indicated the Trump administration is deadly serious about trying to acquire Greenland in some way. I think that we'll have to just continue monitoring how this goes. As we've remarked many times, Trump has a tendency of using a lot of his negotiating leverage publicly. It's one of his tactics. And so it can be a little bit difficult to always tell what's rhetoric and, where the rubber meets the road. But I do think that it's safe to say that this is a major priority for the Trump administration. All right. Well, we're running up on the clock. We really do appreciate you for joining us in our report today. As always, you can expect today's report in your inbox later on. We'll also be back tomorrow at 08 Central Time. And then finally, we'll be getting to some of your additional questions that we were unable to answer during today's show this Friday during our roundtable, which will be on Friday at 10 Central Time. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for all your support. And as always, stay out front.